Our scripture reading today comes from Matthew chapter 26, beginning at verse 57. Hear now the word of God. Then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered. And Peter was following him at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and going inside he sat down with the guards to see the end. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus, that they might put him to death. But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At last 2 came forward and said, "This man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days. And the high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer to make? What is this that these men testify against you?" But Jesus remained silent. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "You have said so. But I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has uttered blasphemy. What further witnesses do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment?" They answered, "He deserves death." Then they spit in his face and struck him, and some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you?" This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. During Lent, I am preaching on the events of the final week of Jesus' ministry, events that led up to his death and resurrection. Last week we heard how Judas betrayed Jesus and the soldiers arrested Jesus in Gethsemane. Today we hear about his trial before the religious leaders. These events are more than just interesting historical facts. They are deeply meaningful. That week changed the world. After that week, God related to humankind in a new way. He had established his new covenant. After that week, even death meant something different. This sermon is going to follow a familiar pattern. First, I'm going to explain to you what happened. Then we'll briefly consider who was responsible. And finally, we will think about what these things mean to us today. So let's get started. When the soldiers arrested Jesus in Gethsemane, they took him to the home of the high priest, Caiaphas. Now, let's stop right here and give this the smell test. Does anything here seem off to you? Think about it. When our sheriff arrests a suspect, does he take the suspect to the mayor's home where the county commission has gathered? Do the state police take suspects to the governor's mansion? I don't think so. What is going on here? The fact that they take Jesus to the home of the high priest tells us this is not an ordinary trial. Not that we should really expect an ordinary trial. It is a sort of hearing, and they try to give it a semblance of legitimacy. But clearly, this is not a legitimate trial. The irregularities in Jesus' trial before the Sanhedrin are well documented. And by the way, the High Council was known as the Sanhedrin. It was made up of the leading priests and experts in the law and elders who came from the leading families of Jerusalem. 70 men plus the high priest made up the Sanhedrin, though for an official meeting they only needed 23 members. The Sanhedrin had authority over the temple and the city of Jerusalem and a lot of influence in Jewish communities around the world. The Romans, of course, had ultimate power, but they counted on the Sanhedrin to keep the temple running smoothly and to keep peace in and around Jerusalem. Meanwhile, the Sanhedrin depended on the Romans for such power as they had. The religious leaders and the Romans did not like each other, but each depended on the other. When Jesus was arrested, it was this council that assembled to deal with him. What were the legal irregularities? Well, first of all, the trial should have taken place in the temple precincts, not at someone's private residence. It should have taken place during daylight hours and not at night. A capital case required at least 2 days of deliberation and therefore should not have been begun less than 48 hours before a holy day or the Sabbath. Jesus was not given legal counsel, and apparently he was not given the opportunity to call witnesses in his defense. Not that he attempted to mount a defense. Now, we should not be surprised that in dealing with Jesus, the religious leaders cut some legal corners. They were in a bind. They needed to deal with Jesus quickly. You remember they were concerned about the crowds, and there were large crowds in Jerusalem for the Passover, and the crowds considered Jesus to be a prophet, or perhaps even something more. So the religious leaders needed to deal with Jesus and eliminate him quickly. This trial was not about justice. It was not about finding the truth. It was about finding a pretext to hand Jesus over to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. Why Pilate? A couple of reasons. One, the Romans reserved to themselves the right to execute criminals. So the Sanhedrin could ban people from the temple or fine them or even beat them, but they could not execute them legally. And number two, the religious leaders didn't want Jesus' blood on their hands anyway. Let the Romans do it. The crowds hated the Romans already. There was nothing the crowds could do about the Romans. Everybody knew that. This is the reason Matthew says that the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death. False testimony doesn't mean they were just looking for liars who would say anything they could make up. Rather, the testimony was just a pretext to arrive at the verdict that had been predetermined. Again, they weren't looking for justice, they were looking for a guilty verdict. And we see this in the little bit of court transcript that the Gospels give to us. By the way, you might be wondering, how did the Gospel writers know what was said at the trial if they weren't there? Well, remember, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus were part of the council, and they were there. Luke even tells us that Joseph did not consent when the council condemned Jesus. Joseph and Nicodemus would later bury Jesus and be numbered among his followers. Also, Luke tells us that after Pentecost, many priests became believers. Maybe a few of them were on the Sanhedrin as well, and perhaps these could have shared what happened. Anyway, 2 witnesses testified. This man said, "I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days." Okay, that's a strange thing to say. And if all we had was Matthew's gospel, we would think they just made this up. We wouldn't know what they were referring to. But thanks to the Gospel of John, we do. And by the way, it is a sign of the accuracy and the trustworthiness of the Gospels that the writers simply tell the story, and in doing that, sometimes one Gospel writer will support or explain something that was said by another Gospel writer. We see that here. We're going to see it again when Jesus has a trial before Pilate. In this case, Matthew either didn't know the background or he didn't consider it important to share. Meanwhile, John does not record this testimony, but he does give us the backstory. In John chapter 2, the religious authorities demanded to know by what authority Jesus was doing the things he was doing, and they demanded a miraculous sign to prove his authority. In response, Jesus said to them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Now, they took his reference to the temple literally, and they replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But John tells his readers he was speaking about the temple of his body. Jesus' resurrection would prove his claims and his authority. But you see how Jesus' statement gets garbled in the mouths of these false witnesses. They turn his statement into a threat against the temple. Now, apparently, this was the best the religious leaders were able to come up with in terms of testimony against Jesus. Jesus, for his part, stood mute. Now, perhaps this was because he didn't want to dignify this sham of a trial by playing along. Perhaps it was because the only reason to mount a defense is that you want to be acquitted. And if Jesus did manage to get himself acquitted, which, let's be honest, was not going to happen, but if he did, then what becomes of God's plan to redeem the world through Jesus' death on the cross? Also, by remaining silent, Jesus fulfilled prophecy. Isaiah 53:7 says, "He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth." Jesus' silence frustrated Caiaphas. He said, "Don't you have anything to say for yourself? Don't you hear what they're saying about you?" But Jesus remained silent. Finally, exasperated, Caiaphas put Jesus under an oath. He said, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." And at this point, Jesus was required to give a truthful answer. Now, his answer always used to bother me. He said, "You have said so." And I used to wonder, what kind of answer is that? It seems kind of weaselly. Like, I could neither affirm nor deny. What's going on with that? Well, it turns out that in the idiom of that day, that was a way to answer affirmatively, but with a qualification. So what Jesus meant was, yes, I am, but you misunderstand what that means. We're going to hear Jesus say this again when he's on trial before Pilate. Pilate will ask him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus will answer, "You have said so," meaning, yes, I am, but you don't know what it means to be the king of the Jews. Now, one thing is certain, Caiaphas certainly took Jesus' answer as a yes. But Jesus immediately went on to clarify what he meant by yes. He said, "But I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Now, what's that about? Jesus' favorite nickname for himself was the Son of Man. Did not mean he was merely human. In fact, it meant he was divine. The Son of Man was a divine figure in Daniel chapter 7 who is exalted to heavenly glory and given everlasting dominion, who sits upon the throne of God. Daniel wrote, "I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, in his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed." This is obviously what Jesus is referring to. And he claims to be this divine person who shares the throne of the God of Israel. Caiaphas reacted forcefully. He tore his robes. Now, tearing one's garments was a sign of grief and anger, but it was also the culturally prescribed response to blasphemy. And Caiaphas says, he has blasphemed. You have heard his blasphemy. What need do we have of further witnesses? And the council condemned Jesus as being worthy of death. Of course, it's only blasphemy if it's not true, which they assumed it wasn't. But that's what happens when you're spiritually blind, right? Then, not content merely just to get Jesus out of the way by killing him, they mock and beat him. Matthew leaves out the detail that they had blindfolded Jesus, though another gospel gives us that detail. And then they began to mock and abuse him. Okay, so that's what happened. And we already know why it happened. Jesus came to Jerusalem, and the town wasn't big enough for both him and the religious leaders. At issue was who speaks for God. The religious leaders deemed Jesus, his message and his ministry to be a threat to their position and privilege, and they reacted the way powerful people often do when they feel threatened. All of this makes perfect historical sense. Meanwhile, God was working out his plan. Jesus was the only one who was in on it. But while everyone else was acting in their own self-interest, God was sovereignly orchestrating events behind the scenes. But there is a question we should ask here. Who was responsible for Jesus' death? Now, maybe we're getting a little ahead of ourselves because we haven't yet considered Pontius Pilate. That's coming in a couple of weeks. But I think we need to ask the question here, because sometimes the Gospels are accused of being anti-Semitic and blaming Jesus' death on the Jews. And there's a sad history of Christian anti-Semitism. Matthew has been accused of being anti-Semitic. So I want to say very clearly that anti-Semitism is a great evil in our world. It is a demonic evil, and Christians should resist and oppose it wherever we find it. Having said that, I don't think the Gospels are anti-Semitic. Every New Testament writer except Luke was a Jew. Jesus and his disciples were Jews. The crowds were Jews. The religious leaders were Jews. Everyone except Pilate and the Roman soldiers were Jews. The argument between the religious leaders and Jesus, and later between the religious leaders and the apostles, was about how to interpret the scriptures and who represents the true Israel, which is a very Jewish argument to have. The Gospels report, and it makes perfect sense, that the religious leaders in Jerusalem perceived Jesus to be a threat, and so they conspired against him. They conspired with the Roman authorities. So we could blame Jesus' death on the religious leaders. They were certainly corrupt and acted with a very self-serving kind of way to abuse their power. We could blame the Romans. Pontius Pilate may have washed his hands, but he could not wash away his guilt that easily. The crucifixion does not happen without his order. So all of that makes perfect historical sense. But there's something deeper going on here. If we want to assign blame for Jesus' death, we need look no further than the nearest mirror. Because the Gospels are clear about one thing: Jesus was not a helpless victim. God was working out his plan to redeem his people. Now, the religious leaders didn't know that. Pontius Pilate didn't know that, but Jesus knew that. He saw his death as a sacrifice that would atone for the sins of his people. He even said, I give my life. No one takes it from me. I lay it down. And he did that for you if you belong to him. He took your place. He bore the punishment that you deserve. So in the deepest, most meaningful sense, we are to blame for Jesus' death. Here is the irony of the cross. In the ancient world, one religion was based on revelation from the one true God. The leaders of this highest, holiest, and best religion conspired to kill the Son of God. And they conspired with representatives of the noblest system of jurisprudence the ancient world ever produced. The Romans were proud of Roman justice because it was based on truth and fairness. And yet the guardians of this precious justice unjustly sent the Son of God to death on a cross. So here we see the worst of human evil. And yet, from it, God saves the world. How amazing is God? We took what was best and we used it for evil. The worst evil imaginable. We abused and killed the innocent Son of God. And yet, God took our evil and used it for good. Praise be to God. It takes a big God to do that. Okay, other than praising God, which we definitely should do, what are we going to do with this? This is more than an interesting historical anecdote. It is more even than an important step in God's plan of redemption. There are things here we need to take to heart, and I want to highlight two of them for you. First, Jesus' trial provides strong evidence that he claimed to be divine. 2 or 3 generations ago, C.S. Lewis provided the world with a strong case for Christianity. He said Jesus is either a liar, a lunatic, or he's the Lord. Now, this argument was not original to Lewis, but he expressed it in a fresh and compelling way. He said Jesus claimed to be God. If that was false, then either Jesus was intentionally deceiving people or he was just some kind of nut. Or it was true. Lewis said, read the Gospels. You will see that Jesus was neither a liar nor a lunatic, therefore he must be the Lord. It's a convincing argument. Many people have found it very helpful on their journey of faith. And it is helpful. But a lot of people reject Jesus not because of evidence, but because they don't want it to be true. And so some clever people trying to escape the forceful logic of Lewis's argument tried to find a way out by saying, well, Jesus never claimed to be God. He never claimed to be divine. That's something later Christians made up, and they just put those words in his mouth. But as I've pointed out many times, their argument fails. Not only in the things that he said, but in the things he did and the stories he told, Jesus claimed to be divine. And here in this account of his trial, we see that even his enemies recognize that. On what charge did they condemn him? Blasphemy. He claimed to be this heavenly Son of Man who shares God's throne. He made himself equal to God. And they understood clearly what he was saying and condemned him as a blasphemer. So ironically, Jesus' enemies who conspired to kill him prove his modern critics wrong. Jesus did claim to be divine. And as he pointed out in John chapter 2, in that statement that got garbled at his trial, his resurrection proves that he was telling the truth. Now, second, Jesus' trial shows us the worst of humanity. This is not about Jews and Romans. This is about human beings and our broken, sinful human nature. In this trial, we see corruption, we see a self-serving abuse of power, we see injustice, we see cruelty. All that is worst in human nature. We see the ugliness of it. And it's like a mirror. Now you may say, oh, I would never do something like that. Okay, maybe not. But why not? Is it because you don't have the power? If you were in their shoes, you would do exactly the same thing? Or maybe you would never do anything like that. So this is not really a mirror for you as an individual about who you are, but it is still a mirror for us about what we are as human beings. The account of Jesus' trial should make us question our assumptions, if we have any, of our own righteousness. We human beings like to give ourselves the benefit of a doubt. We like to think that we are right and true and good and all of that. But what if we're not? The trial of Jesus, the events of this last week of Jesus' ministry show us what happens when God's love meets human sin. And it is horrifying. Yet set in sharp relief against this background of human depravity is the wonder of God's love. We take what is best and we use it for evil, horrific evil, abusing, torturing, killing the innocent Son of God. And yet, like a judo master, God turns that around and uses it to save us from sin and death. Our sin is great. His grace is greater. And Jesus' trial shows us both the depths of our brokenness and our need for that grace. Amen.